1485, and Henry Tudor has defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He was subsequently crowned King Henry VII. Henry married Elizabeth, the daughter of the Yorkist King Edward IV, which united the claims of both the houses of York and Lancaster into the House of Tudor. This brought about the end of the Wars of the Roses, and many historians also consider this to be the end of the medieval period in England and the beginning of the early modern age. Henry's early reign was plagued by the issue of stability, and he faced many rebellions, notably that of Lambert Simnel in 1487, who was backed by powerful lords such as John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln. Henry crushed the rebels at the Battle of Stoke and even pardoned Simnel, who was simply a puppet. In 1489, Henry, in an attempt to strengthen his position at home, signed the Treaty of Medina del Campo with the Kingdom of Aragon. This treaty arranged a marriage between Henry's eldest son and heir, Prince Arthur, and Catherine, the daughter of the Aragonese king. Tensions and unrest continued for the next few years until another pretender to the throne, a man called Perkin Warbeck, made himself known in 1491. Warbeck claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the second son of Edward IV and the younger brother of Edward V. Warbeck spent 5 years gathering supporters, which included the King of Scotland, with whom Warbeck launched a raid into the north. In 1497, Henry levied taxes to raise his own army, which caused rioting in Cornwall. The reason for this was that the Cornish, who had a very strong regional identity and the majority of whom did not even speak English, did not believe they should pay for an army to fight in the north. The riots turned to rebellion and an army marched on London but was ultimately defeated. Henry then turned his attention to Scotland and after some fighting managed to agree to what was called the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, called so because everyone should have dreams. Immediately after this, Warbeck landed in Cornwall and raised another rebellious army which laid siege to Exeter. This siege failed, Warbeck was captured and soon after paraded through London and hanged. Henry's efforts to cement the House of Tudor were widespread and included a large-scale purge of any Yorkists or potential threats which lasted for decades. Harsh restrictions were placed on inheritance rights and financial penalties were common. In 1499, Prince Arthur, now being of age, was married to Catherine of Aragon, but the two wouldn't meet until late 1501 when she arrived in England. The marriage wasn't a particularly long one, since Arthur died in 1502, forever robbing England of having an actual King Arthur. Attempts began immediately to have Catherine marry the now heir to England, Prince Henry, but things were complicated. Some of these complications were due to a succession crisis in Castile, which was basically unified with Aragon, and because it was against church law for someone to marry their brother's widow, a law which would become very relevant shortly. King Henry would go on to die in 1509, and his reign was ultimately a successful one since he secured his new dynasty. Henry was also responsible for securing important alliances and centralising power, which made some of his ministers very unpopular because nobody likes being taxed or being told what to do. Henry also importantly stabilised the country and fixed its finances, which is why his death was not followed by a war of succession. He was succeeded by his son, Henry, who had recently married Catherine of Aragon and was crowned King Henry VIII. Henry wanted to be liked and so had his father's most unpopular ministers arrested, tried for high treason and executed. So Henry saw himself as a successor to the likes of Edward III and Henry V, meaning he wanted to be a king remembered for his glorious conquests. Since Henry didn't care much for governing, he left most of it to a man called Thomas Wolsey. Henry liked Wolsey because he did as he was told and seldom said no to the king, which the king was a fan of. Wolsey soon after was made the Bishop of Lincoln, the Archbishop of York, a Cardinal of Rome, and in 1515 he was appointed as the Lord Chancellor, the highest office in the land. 2 years prior to this, Henry had done what all good English kings did: invade France. This was a part of a larger war called the War of the League of Cambrai, and England's most notable ally was the Holy Roman Empire. Henry led his army personally and won a victory at the Battle of the Spurs. There was an attempt at peace in 1515, but this all fell through when the new French king came to the throne, Francis I. Wolsey did manage to secure a peace with France 3 years later, which laid the foundation for the Treaty of London, which made peace between the European powers. This peace was literally supposed to last forever, but fun fact, no. 2 years later, Henry and Francis met to celebrate their newfound peace here at what was later called the Field of the Cloth of Gold because of the tents being gold. This was essentially a very expensive attempt at one-upmanship by both kings, but it would have meant more had the peace actually lasted. In the next war, English forces got within 50 miles of Paris. However, they didn't receive the reinforcements they were promised by the Holy Roman Empire and so retreated and abandoned the war. After this, Francis I was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor. The French lost the war and England got nothing, which upset Henry. After Francis was released in 1526, he asked Henry for an alliance against the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, which Henry agreed to, and so, another war. At home, Wolsey was reforming the methods of tax collection as well as regulating farming practices. Wolsey was also made a papal legate, that is, a personal representative of the Pope, and he was so powerful that he was often referred to as Alter Rex, or the other king. Being a papal legate gave Wolsey immense authority over the church, which he attempted to reform, but not much came of it. The writings of Martin Luther, which were disseminated thanks to the invention of the printing press, had a great impact on the calls for reform. The Dutch scholar Erasmus was calling for a purer form of spirituality and stayed in Cambridge from 1511 to 1514. Erasmus's friend Thomas More was also a renowned thinker whose most notable work, Utopia, questioned the ethical foundations of society. Henry's position on church reform was made clear in 1520 when Martin Luther criticised the Seven Sacraments. Henry jumped to their defence and wrote a treaty defending them and was subsequently awarded the title Fide Defensor, the Protector of the Faith, a title still in use today. Of course, as everyone knows, Henry is not famous for his good relations with the Pope, but of course the opposite. So by 1527, Henry had had 5 children by Catherine, and all but one, a daughter called Mary, had died or were miscarried. Henry saw this as God punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, and also, given the fact that he was head over heels for some lady called Anne Boleyn, he wanted his marriage dissolved. A quick side note, Henry never asked for divorce, but an annulment. The difference being that a divorce is a dissolution of a legitimate marriage, and an annulment is where a marriage is declared having never been legitimate in the first place. Henry asked the Pope to dissolve the marriage, but this didn't happen for one simple reason: Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So during the previous war, Charles V had captured Rome and with it, the Pope. Charles was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon and didn't want to see his aunt shamed, so made it clear to the Pope, no annulment. Wolsey had been no help, and Henry felt that his position as a papal legate meant his loyalty could no longer be assured, and so in 1529 Henry had him removed as Lord Chancellor. He was replaced by Thomas More, who immediately told Henry that his marriage should remain intact. More would resign 3 years later, and so Henry appointed a replacement called Thomas Cromwell. It appeared Henry wasn't going to get his divorce, and so in a small ceremony he married Anne Boleyn because she's a bit pregnant and I need to get married before the birth, otherwise the child won't be legitimate and I could really do with an heir. This act of bigamy was followed up by Cromwell getting Parliament to pass the Act of Restraint in appeals to Rome, which meant that clergy had to appeal to Henry on matters of religion, not the Pope. This act formally declared that the realm of England is an empire governed by one supreme head and king, meaning that Henry was in charge of everything and that England was independent of all foreign powers and influences. Catherine's marriage to Henry was declared invalid by Henry, and Anne Boleyn was crowned queen. Shortly afterwards, she gave birth not to a son but to a daughter, Elizabeth. In 1534, Henry pushed through the Act of Supremacy, which declared himself and his heirs to be the supreme head in earth of the Church of England. In the same year, Parliament passed the Treason Act, meaning that disagreeing with this meant you'd probably lose your head. This was the case with Thomas More, who refused to go along with this, and so beheaded. Henry faced a couple of setbacks in 1536. He had suppressed many of the smaller monasteries in England because of their close ties to the Pope and had essentially taken all of their wealth. This led to a couple of fierce revolts in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, which Henry defeated. Queen Anne was critical of this, and combined with the lack of son meant she had to go. Henry had Cromwell draw up charges of treason, infidelity, and even incest. She was given a slightly rigged trial, convicted, and beheaded. Henry was then free to marry another lady he was infatuated with, Jane Seymour, which he did. Jane would do what the previous wives had failed to do. She bore him a son, Edward, in 1537, but due to the complications of childbirth, she died 2 weeks later. Cromwell was now firmly entrenched in a position of power, and along with Henry began to reform the new Church of England. Generally speaking, they towed a line between the Catholic faith and the Protestant extremes. Cromwell also backed the printing of the Bible in English, although church services remained in Latin, and he began to dissolve the rest of the monasteries, an event which has been given the inventive name, the Dissolution of the Monasteries. This was completed by 1539, and Henry made a lot of money from it, which he would promptly waste on palaces and paying the debts on his previous wars. In 1540, Henry got married again, mostly against his will because Cromwell kept nagging him, to Anne of Cleves. Cleves is here, by the way. The marriage was not a happy one, and it was declared unconsummated and annulled. Henry blamed Cromwell, who swiftly fell from grace before being arrested and then beheaded in 1540. There is a pattern emerging. On the same day as Cromwell's execution, Henry married Catherine Howard. This marriage would last for a whopping 16 months before she was caught having an affair, which when you're married to the King of England is not a smart idea. She was subsequently arrested, tried for treason, and beheaded. Henry's problems weren't just concerned with his marriages, but with foreign policy. There had been numerous unsuccessful revolts in Ireland, and in 1541 Henry changed his title from the Lord of Ireland, a title historically granted by the Pope, to the King of Ireland. Henry was hoping for war with France at this point, but needed to deal with their Scottish ally first. Henry wanted to unite the two crowns by marrying his son to the daughter of the Scottish king. Scotland refused, and so war. This war is called the Rough Wooing because Henry was literally fighting the Scottish king in order to force a marriage. It was also at this time in 1543 when Henry married his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. So in his late life, Henry had become morbidly obese and could no longer move himself. He suffered from many other ailments and he died from an infection in 1547 at the age of 55. The throne then passed to his son, who at the age of 9 was crowned King Edward VI, who would have the tough job of uniting a religiously divided kingdom. Thus ended the reign of one of England's most important kings, whose decision to break with Rome would dictate England's foreign policy for the next 2 centuries. It is important to note that little of this would have been possible had his father Henry VII not laid a strong and legitimate foundation for his reign though. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations in the description below if you'd like to learn more.